Hello, world history students. This is Mr. Everton, and this is a video about the Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange, as you might guess, is named after Columbus. And you can get an indication here from this map what it is we're talking about. We're talking about things traveling across the Atlantic Ocean, things leaving the Eastern Hemisphere and going to the Western Hemisphere, and then things leaving the Western Hemisphere and going to the Eastern Hemisphere. So when we talk about the Columbian Exchange, we're not talking about trade routes. We're not talking about people so much. We're talking about a biological unification of the Eastern and the Western hemispheres. What do I mean by biological? Like plants and animals and also like microscopic organisms are all things that are going across the Atlantic Ocean, and then sometimes we're also talking about cultural things. But like, for example, I'm not a fan of Hawaiian pizza, but just let's pretend that you ordered a Hawaiian pizza. Well, like before Christopher Columbus, you could not have eaten Hawaiian pizza because the tomatoes that are on a pizza come from the Western Hemisphere, but the wheat that is used to make the flour that you make into the pizza dough, that comes from the Eastern Hemisphere. So does the pork, right? If you're going to have pepperoni or ham or any kind of pork on your pizza, pigs come from the Eastern Hemisphere, from Europe, from Asia. They don't come from the Americas. Pineapple. If you want to put pineapple on your pizza, God knows why you'd want to do that. That's an atrocity. But if you did that, those come from the Western Hemisphere. And cheese, which is made from the milk of cows. They didn't have cows in the Americas. Cows come from the Middle East. So something like pizza could not exist before the Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange is a really big deal. Sometimes you hear the Western Hemisphere referred to as the New World, and the Eastern Hemisphere referred to as the Old World. I'm not going to refer to it that way, but sometimes people do, and I wanted you to know that. Also, if you look at this map, you can get a sense of some of the products that are moving back and forth across the Atlantic. And what was happening was, as Spanish explorers and conquistadors, or Portuguese explorers or English colonists, as they crossed the Atlantic Ocean, or as enslaved people from Africa across the Atlantic Ocean, they would bring certain things with them, right? And they would bring those things with them. And then if they left, when Europeans and Africans left, usually Europeans, left the Western Hemisphere, they would bring things back with them. And so some of the things that crossed from the Western Hemisphere to the Eastern Hemisphere include corn, tomatoes, potatoes, peanuts, beans, chocolate, tobacco, peppers. That's a lot of important crops that people didn't have access to in the Eastern Hemisphere. And then from the Eastern Hemisphere, you have things like honeybees, sugarcane, bananas, coffee, onions, all kinds of livestock like cattle, sheep, pigs, horses, chickens. Those things all come from the Eastern Hemisphere. So how did this affect people? Well, in the Eastern Hemisphere, so like in Europe and Asia specifically is what I'm thinking of here, it led to an increase in population, because crops like potatoes became new staple food crops for poor people. Like this painting from 1885 is called The Potato Eaters. And this is a group of poor people. By 1885, a couple hundred years after the Columbian Exchange, potatoes were so common in Europe that they were thought of as like a staple for poor people. And eating potatoes was like synonymous with being a poor person, to the point where when the potato crop failed in Ireland, you had a famine called the Irish Potato Famine, and lots of people starved and ended up leaving Ireland if they survived. Another effect, so like that, all that new food led to an increase in the population. That's the point. Another effect was that Europeans crossed the Atlantic Ocean and started setting up plantations where they were growing cash crops like tobacco and sugar and cotton. And that money tended to benefit Europeans in the Eastern Hemisphere. And those cash crops tended to head back to the Eastern Hemisphere, right? So people in Europe got more access to things like cotton and sugar and a variety of different cash crops. This led to cultural changes, right? Like, can you imagine Italian food without tomatoes? Right? Like Italian cuisine was completely changed. Irish cuisine, French cuisine, all the ways that people ate in Spain, all of these countries had very different ways of eating after the Columbian Exchange. And then there were also diseases like syphilis. Syphilis is a sexually transmitted disease that, if untreated, will make you go insane and kill you. And a lot of sailors brought syphilis back from the Western Hemisphere to the Eastern Hemisphere, and it became a real problem in the Eastern Hemisphere. Now, in the Western Hemisphere, disease was much more of an issue. I mean, syphilis is bad. Nobody wants that. But in the Western Hemisphere, they were exposed to new diseases like smallpox, the mumps, and typhus. This is a picture of the germ that causes smallpox. And this is an illustration of some indigenous Americans suffering from smallpox. We don't know exactly how many indigenous Americans, when I say indigenous Americans, I mean Native Americans. We don't know how many indigenous Americans there were before Europeans came to the Western Hemisphere. We estimate, historians and archaeologists estimate, that somewhere between 50% and 90% of the Native American population died, in large part because of diseases that were brought by Europeans. They didn't have any immunity to those diseases. Europeans had been exposed to things like smallpox and mumps before. By the way, this is what smallpox looks like. It covers your body in these little sores. It's an incredibly lethal disease that, we talked about how it's been cured, right? We talked about the smallpox vaccine. This was before the smallpox vaccine had happened. And, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Native Americans died from diseases like smallpox. Another incredibly important effect in the Western Hemisphere were new animals, things like these pigs. We have a population in our country in North America of feral hogs, right? Hogs that live in the wild and are wild and untamed. The reason why they're there is because Spanish soldiers, conquistadors, when they came to the Americas to try to conquer the Aztecs and conquer the Southwest United States, they brought pigs with them. And they didn't want to have to take care of the pigs, so they released the pigs into the forest. And then whenever they were hungry and they needed some meat, they would go hunt a pig. But pigs reproduce really quickly, and so the pig population exploded. And so even to this day we have wild pigs living in North America. That's not the main point. The main point is that domesticated farm animals like pigs, like cows, like horses and chickens, they didn't have any of those in the Western Hemisphere. All those, when you imagine Native Americans, you might be imagining a Native American on the Great Plains riding a horse hunting buffalo, right? Before Columbus, there were no horses. They had to hunt buffalo walking. Before Columbus, there were no cows. There were no chickens. And so having new animals in order to help them, for food and in order to help do labor on farms was incredibly helpful. And then finally, another effect of the Columbian Exchange was that in the New World, Europeans, as part of colonization, began to make plantations, large-scale farms where they would go cash crops. Remember, a cash crop is a crop that you don't grow to eat usually. You grow it because you can sell it for money. So even though you can eat sugar, you don't live off of sugar, right? It's a luxury item that you can use to make desserts and sweet things. That's a cash crop. Tobacco is a cash crop. Cotton, indigo, rice. Even though rice is a staple food, it was grown on plantations in South Carolina as a cash crop that was sold for money. And because so many Native Americans were dying from disease during this time period, and because Native Americans knew the terrain and it was easy for them to escape, right? They knew the surrounding area, so it was pretty easy for them to escape. This led to a need for labor, and the Europeans didn't want to do the work. So what they started to do, that's my cat sneezing, by the way. What they started to do to make these plantations work is they started to buy slaves from Africa, or sometimes just straight up steal slaves from Africa. This is kidnap people, or they would get somebody else to kidnap them and then they would buy them. This is a close-up of a sugarcane plantation. That's what sugarcane looks like when it's being harvested. And it was harvested by enslaved African laborers who were taken from Africa and brought to the Americas. We tend to think of slavery in terms of American slavery, but I think it's really important to know that there were more slaves that went to Brazil and the Caribbean than there were to the United States. That's not to say that what the United States did was any less terrible, but it is to say that it's not just the United States that did slavery. Slavery happened throughout the Americas, and there were a lot of sugar plantations in the Caribbean and a lot of sugar plantations in Brazil that participated in slavery even more than what was happening in the United States.